Good morning. I'm Jerry Frost. I'd like to welcome to Journey into Life and Work, our weekly Bible study, brought to you by our Sunday School department here at First Baptist. And as always, it's a privilege to share with you on Sunday mornings as we look at God's Word. Today we're continuing in our study in the book of Exodus, and today we're going to move over into Leviticus for one part. But today we're looking at a lesson entitled Protection, and we see that God expects His people to protect the vulnerable. And so today is a day that we normally set aside, or is set aside. I don't normally set aside. It is set aside for Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. And so today, throughout the areas and throughout churches, there is attention drawn on human life and how important it is. And, you know, it's been said that the measure of society is how it treats its weakest members. And I thought about that a lot, and I can understand that and see that. It's sad today that our world is so filled with so many people that are homeless. And it is discouraging when you see what's going on in that area and how I don't say that they're mistreated, how it's handled. And then I don't know how you handle it. There's so many, and so anyway, but I read that statement, and that's what came to mind when I read that. You know, this statement captures a piece of biblical truth, vital for all of God's people. You know, Jesus spoke of how people would be judged according to how they were treated. He said, the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, when they were thirsty, when they were hungry, a stranger, naked, sick, and in prison, and how they treated these weak and vulnerable members of the community, Jesus says, you did for me. So as we treat others, it's the same way that we're treating Jesus. I think about the love of God, and the love of God that we have in our hearts. And it's hard to look at things like we see today and have the love of God and not understand why something's not going on with it and something's happening to correct it. And so anyway, you know, every person is created in God's image. You know, Genesis 1, 26 and 28 tells us that, and they are distinct from all other creatures. And God's image is described in royalty language. It's of ruling over every living thing. Every person being made in God's image has far-reaching implications. The rich do not bear God's image any more than the poor. Males are not the only gender to bear God's image. Females do as well. People of color, white people, people of color, both bear the image of God. They were all created in God's images. You know, Jews doesn't bear the image more than Gentiles. And so anyway, every human being should be treated with dignity and respect. Because each person is made by God Himself in the image of God. So this is sort of what we're looking at today, touching on some of those things. You know, if you'll remember, last week we were dealing with the Ten Commandments, and the Israelites had gotten to Mount Sinai, and you know, and God had given extensive instructions about how to apply these 10 commandments. You know, 5 were dealing with God, and 5 were dealing with relating to others, and you know, and it dealt with everyday life and how to live as God's people. And so anyway, we see here that this relationship dealt with worship and human interactions, and this reminds us that we can't divorce our relationship with God from how we treat people. We're to treat people. You know, Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And He said, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy soul, and thy mind. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so, you know, it's important that we take this and we take it to heart. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about vulnerable people and how to protect them. We're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 22 and Leviticus. And so after giving Moses the 10 Commandments, God outlined additional laws for his people. The Israelites were to recall their own oppression, thinking about how they had been treated by the Egyptian, and then avoiding treating others in the same way. And so they were not to mistreat or exploit vulnerable people, including widows and orphans. So, Teresa, let's look at Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 through 24.
Okay, Jerry, I must right a wrong. You know, we need to have times we can say, I made a mistake last week, and can I do that now? And you should have told me when I did it. Okay, remember we were talking about the ark? Yeah. And I said something about whether they find the ark on the top of Mount Ararat or whatever in Turkey. That's not the right ark. No. That ark is the big Noah's ark.
Yeah. We were talking about the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes, we were discussing the Ark of the Covenant, and I thought, oh, what a dummy, you said that. I can't believe you said that. And I thought, I should have come in and told him to cut it right away, but because I thought about it the first of the week, but I didn't. But anyway, you know that the Ark of the Covenant, we're not sure where it is, but I'm sure I told you last week that the consensus from a lot of people is the Ethiopian Orthodox people have it in a building there somewhere. I don't remember the name of the city, but nobody's ever seen it that can verify that that's what it is. So that would be very interesting. The other ark, they've got all these pictures that they put down on the mountain, and they see the shape that could be the shape of the ark that would have rotted, of course, and left indentions or whatever by then. So both of those, we don't know where they are, and really it doesn't matter. If it did, God would tell us where they were. Okay, let's read verses 21 and 22. You must not exploit a resident alien or oppress him, since you were resident aliens in the land of Egypt. You must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless. This is that loving God that we think about, that loves us so much and has done so much for us. But this is one side of him. He's a loving God. He is, and he loves us more than anybody else could, more than we could understand love. But also, he's a judgmental God, and he has to be both, to be a fair God, an honest God, a God who functions like he does. And so here we are with him trying to straighten out the people that are in bad shape being treated badly and not being able to help themselves. Jerry talked about the homeless and the orphans and, all of this. And yes, that is a terrible thing. And I'm sure that there are human reasons for these people being that way. We've done something or not done something right to have so many. But the ones I think about too are the unborn. And those are the ones who the statistics are tremendously over anything else that we could come up with. Those are the definite weakest members. They have no say-so, no word in what's done to them, no action whatsoever. Yet we are murdering children by the scores. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands a year over the earth. So this is something that God abhors. I mean, it's murder. He says it's murder, and we're probably paying for it right now. In some of the things that God allows to happen. But anyway, he's giving careful instructions for our path and for us to direct our path. And this reflects his character because he loves everybody and he wants everybody to be treated well. And he refers to many times that he walks with us and he knows all of these things happen. And he said, if you treat these people badly, if you treat the widows and the orphans badly, if you treat each other badly, if you treat people from another nation badly, I'm going to see it. Plus, they're going to cry out to me. And when they cry out to me, I'm going to punish those people who need to be punished. So we see a very loving God, but also a God who keeps up. He keeps up with those things. We want to judge, and we're told in the Bible that God will judge, that He will not miss anything. He will take care of it. We want things done right then, and if we did, we'd probably be the ones that He squished. So anyway, God's character demands His wrath against things that are done in a wrong way. His wrath grows out of His compassion, because he loves us so much. The two Hebrew words exploit and oppress have described the wicked and the powerful who take from the poor, and usually by force or deception. And we see so much of that, and it's so sad. The Egyptians had oppressed Israel. They had taken advantage of them. The Israelites believed in God. They didn't want to treat anybody badly. And the Egyptians had become fearful because they were doing so well. They were multiplying so fast in the land of Egypt. And so they said, these people are going to take over. They're going to do something bad. They're going to want to take over the government and run over us. And of course, they would not have. But Israel made those people slaves, and they made them slaves for a very long time. So that and their idolatry that God had to watch was really something that He needed to humiliate them about. And so he's telling them now, he demands His people take care of those around them, and He is not happy about the Egyptians and what they're doing. So when we hear that Hebrew term, resident alien, it's also used as refugee or immigrant, and we hear those words a lot nowadays. And he says these are landless residents who were not Israelites and had limited rights, and they were taken advantage of because of that. I don't think we're taking advantage of anybody. I think we've been taken advantage of, and that's my opinion, and I shouldn't. And Ab always told me not to give my opinion. I'm sure it's because he knew my opinion was not always right. But these are familiar terms to us now. Such an alien would be very vulnerable to the Egyptians, and these people had nothing. I mean, they didn't really have land. They were on rented time there, and so they were used as slaves. But the motivation for showing mercy as God has given us appears so many times in the Old Testament and the New. And we see a lot of people that need our care and need our love and need our help. So He's trying to get to the Israelites, to their memories of being slaves in Egypt, and saying, remember how you were done, and this is not the way you want to be done. That's not the way we live, is it? We live as, I'm going to do to others as they do to me, regardless of what it is. And of course, that is exactly the opposite from what God would tell us. Then he says other landless people would include the widows and the fatherless. Widows had a really bad time back in Old Testament days. There was no welfare system. And when the husband died, the widow had to depend on a male from that family. Widows did not inherit. So when a widow died, even if she didn't have children, there are many instances in the Bible where the whole estate, whether big or little, went to maybe a cousin or maybe a brother-in-law. And went to a person who was not even maybe close to the husband. And he was not obligated to take care of this widow. And so I'm not sure how the women managed those days, but they were certainly discriminated against. They certainly were not helped in the system. So God hears the cries of His people when we pray, when we ask for forgiveness, when we ask for help, when we intercede for somebody else. He hears every word, and He answers every prayer. May not be exactly the way we want it answered, but He answers them.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, as she's mentioned, it's the weak, the oppressed. That includes the elderly, the unemployed, the disabled, the foreigners, the homeless, the poor. those otherwise disadvantaged. All of these people are precious in God's sight, and definitely we can't forget those that are helpless among us, being the unborn, because God says He knew us before we were ever formed in our mother's womb. So He's the one that does that, and so we need to be conscious of that. And so they are not given a voice, and if they were given a voice in such life and death decisions, what would they say? And God calls us to speak for them, and it's amazing, and I've heard this stated before. The people who are for abortion were not aborted. I mean, think about that. I mean, you're standing here and you're fighting for this, but you're alive, and they aren't. So it's definitely a matter of very, very importance for consideration. Well, we looked at the exploitation, and so there was even being deceived and taken advantage of through the lending practices that were going on. And chapter 22, verses 25 through 27 talks about that. It says, if you lend silver to my people, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a creditor to him. You must not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak or as collateral, return it to him before sunset, for it is his only covering. It is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen, because I am gracious. Okay. Well, God outlines laws for helping a poverty-stricken person. They were not to charge interest on monetary loans, but instead were to treat the person with dignity. Additionally, if a cloak was used as collateral, they were not to keep that cloak overnight, as the owner would need it for warmth. And of course, he talks about hearing the cries of those who are in need, and God would definitely hear those. So this verse introduces a whole nother group than what we began with, and they found themselves in a very vulnerable state. Individuals who had to borrow from someone else is what it was. They didn't have the means in order to continue, and so this instructions were not directed at the borrower. It wasn't the borrower that was at fault for trying to borrow something. It was the lender who was the one who could potentially exploit vulnerable people. And of course, that was by doing unfair practices, lending, bartering, borrowing, that was common practices in the ancient world. And the Israelites considered it noble to lend a fellow Israelite who was in need to help take care of him. And neighbors and family members would lend without expectation of financial gain. And so, they say that coined money didn't even begin until 600 BC, so it was pretty much I'll pay you with what I produce or this type of thing. And so in time, people learned that they could profit financially by lending to others. How could that have happened? If you think about it, just in looking at it, if someone lent a farming to the neighbor so he could plow the ground and raise a crop, the borrower would return the two, and then he would give some of the harvested crop to the tool owner. And so the additional amount that came to be expected was where we get the word interest. That's where that started from, interest. Everyone's familiar with interest, and so anyway, it began to be more and more profitable for you to do this, and instead of you being able to give that person what you felt was reasonable, all of a sudden the person that was doing the lending began to tell you what he was going to lend you the two for and what you would have to give him if you wanted to borrow the two. So that's where it all turned around and became like it was. It wasn't that the one that was borrowing the two could give something back cheerfully or be generous in giving back. then it become a charge. And so, God didn't forbid all lending and charging interest. He did, however, ban one Israelite from charging another Israelite interest. Charging interest changed the relationship. All of a sudden, feelings began to be hurt. Maybe they were being charged unfairly, and maybe we've been involved in some of that situation. I think if you build a house today, I think you got to pay like 9.7 or 8% interest in order to borrow the money to build a house today, and that may make you upset to have to do that. But anyway, no longer was the lender merely a friend or a relative. He became a creditor to him. So charging no interest kept the lender's heart from being greedy, and he was not lending for financial gain. His motive was to help his needy neighbor. Verses 26 and 27 talks about collateral. All of us know what collateral is. If you want to go and borrow a sum of money, they request that you put something of value up in order to assure that that loan is going to be paid. So the borrower in these verses was destitute. He didn't have anything, and having no other items of value, so he gave his cloak. Well, the cloak that he had was a piece of material that had a hole cut in it that he put over his body, and it was the only article of clothing a poor man really owned, except for the loincloth that he was wearing. And he would wear it during the day and cover himself with it at night, sort of as a blanket, to protect him from the chilly air. And so the instruction doesn't prohibit taking the cloak, but it does prohibit keeping it overnight and allowing this guy to be cold through the night and not being able to be warm. Then the day laborers were at the bottom rung of the economic ladder. Those seeking employment might give their cloak to guarantee a full day's work. In other words, okay, well, I'll work for you all day long, and here's my cloak to guarantee that I'm going to do the job and I'm going to stay with you until the end of the day, and so if that person didn't live up to those expectations, then the employer might just keep the coat. The cloak until that was fulfilled. And so by doing that, this robbed the worker of his freedom, and so he actually became a slave to the owner. He was being forced to work at least long enough to get his belongings back. And so that was holding on to the cloak would humiliate this person and embarrass him and made him even more vulnerable. And so, the destitute person did have one unseen weapon in his arsenal. He could cry out to the all-powerful God if this was happening. And how many times have we seen the Israelites that did that, called out to God, and God intervened on their behalf, when the Egyptians were mistreating them in their work and taking advantage of them through their work and everything that they were doing. They cried out, and so God heard them. And so this wasn't a small whimper. It was a roar for help from the destitute borrower. I'm cold. I'm going to be cold. I need to get my cloak back, And so part of God's concern with this instruction was he did not want his people to treat others as the Egyptian had treated the Israelites. And so, God promised to listen to the vulnerable person's cry for help. He told him, he said, I'll hear it. In doing so, he was being true to his character as a gracious and a loving God. And so the lesson is clear as God's people. We're to show compassion, we're to show love and kindness to the vulnerable and those that are in need. And so, Teresa, let's finish up there as we move to Leviticus now, chapter 19, and we'll look at verses 9 through 10. And we'll talk about the harvest and reaping the crops.
Okay, let's read those. When you reap the harvest of your land, you're not to reap the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not strip your vineyard bare or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the resident alien. I am the Lord your God. Just very simple instructions. And of course, I don't guess that fits in today with exactly how we are answering his call for well, not pity, but, urgency to help the poor, to help those who can't survive on their own or who have problems. But he wanted us to give, and that's as simple as that. We don't leave the edge of our fields, because there are probably not people who would come and gather or know to come and gather or know what to do with it, unless it was the grapes and they could eat those. But he's got the point across. Scholars often refer to this passage in Leviticus as the holiness code. I'd never heard that before, but it certainly is good. And it involves qualities such as uniqueness and separateness, purity, devotion. It's a major theme of the book of Leviticus, is to be holy as God is holy. And he certainly directs us to do that. The ultimate standard of holiness is when we have that faith to be holy, and we want to be. We love our fellow man, may not like the situation, may not like what they do, but we love them because they are children of God, and we need to be holy as God is holy. So you read about these places of holiness in the Bible, and we would say the burning bush would be holy, because when Moses approached it, God told him to take his sandals off because he was standing on holy ground. And that's one of the biggies. Mount Sinai would be considered as holy. The tabernacles, the temples, the tents of worship would be holy because God's presence was there. And so there are several holy places, because they do represent a place for us to worship, a place that we feel close to God. So, defending the sanctity of human life is a prime example of holiness. In a very fallen world, with a lot of people who have such an attitude that the baby can be actually born and then killed. And the little group that I work with at the courthouse, we were discussing this one day, and one of the ladies said, "Oh, that doesn't really happen." And I said, "Oh, yes, it does." And she didn't believe me. She said, "I just don't believe that happens. I don't believe a doctor would kill a child after it was born, actually after it breathed its first breath." And she didn't believe me, but it happens, and people are trying every day to get it to happen in more of our states. It seems logical to us that when what we produce, what we work to purchase is ours, but that is not true. Everything is God's. He has made possible everything that we have, and he owns everything, and we're supposed to be stewards of his possessions as our possessions or his resources. Since we are God's agents, we are to share. We are to be compassionate with the things that we have, and we're to share them with people. So really, God provides us with more than we need so that we can help others. Or either sometimes we might give something that we really needed, but we feel the compassion and the faith to be able to give it away so that somebody else can have it. When he talks about it, was really interesting what they say. That when you're gathering from your field, don't gather all the way to the edge. Of course, that would be the easiest part for somebody needy to get to in those days. And so they didn't. They left. I don't know if God ever specified in anything how much. 4 feet, 6 feet, 20 feet. I have no idea how big their plots were back in that day. But he said, don't go to the edge and gather. Excuse me. Leave that for people to pick. And then about the vineyards, don't pick all the grapes. Leave some on the edge. So, and then when he mentions gleanings, that would be what people, when they're gathering, something falls off the basket or it falls out of their arms. Leave the gleanings there too, so that folks can pick that up. So, the grape harvest, the wheat, or whatever else, the olives, the Holy Land is just full of olive trees, and so that was a major crop in those days. God certainly honors hard work and diligence, but he also honors people who are not able to do that and who need help in just surviving, really. So God meets the needs of those who trust Him, and He often uses us to help others.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, in today's lesson, as we've looked at it, dealing with protection and being there for those that are vulnerable, we see that it is our responsibility to care for vulnerable people. We're to offer dignity to those in need, and we're to physically help those in need. And so, the welfare of others is just not a story that we read in the Bible, and it wasn't just the concern of the ancient Israelites, though it was a vital part of God's covenant with them. It remains a challenge for us today as Christ followers in the world that we live in today. While we have to be wise with our stewardship as individuals and as churches, we still have a God-given obligation to provide relief for those in genuine need. The responsibility to care for the less fortunate might be a choice for many people in the world, but it's not a choice for us as Christians. It's a command from God as we follow Him that we help to protect those who are vulnerable and need our help. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. Next Sunday we're going to be looking at instructions. We'll be moving on to Exodus chapter 25 and focusing on a few verses there, and then jumping over to chapter 31 and a few verses there as we look at a lesson entitled Instructions, and we see God desires a relationship with His people. So read that up and then be prepared as we come together again next Sunday to share that with you during this time. So for Teresa Henry, for the TV ministry here at First Baptist Church, I'm Jerry Price, hoping you have a great day in the Lord, and we look forward to being with you again next Sunday as we journey into life and work. Thank you for being with us today.